If this is a trap, it's a quiet one. Ethan Cole muttered, his voice barely carrying over the wind that scraped across the barren plateau at nearly 60 miles per hour, each grain of rust-colored dust tapping against his visor like static, the sky above a dull copper haze that swallowed the horizon whole. And then he saw her, a figure crumpled against the jagged remains of a survey beacon, blue skin catching the dim light like fractured glass, her shoulders trembling in uneven breaths as if the air itself resisted her. And for a moment he didn't move, because nothing on this planet cried like that. Not the machines, not the wildlife, not anything he'd logged in the past 6 months of isolation. And yet there she was, fragile in a way that didn't fit the stories he'd been told about her kind, about aliens who calculated, who dominated, who never showed weakness where it could be seen. And still she lifted her head just enough for him to catch the shine of her eyes, luminous, searching, locking onto him as if she had been waiting for this exact moment, this exact man. And Ethan felt that familiar pull in his chest, the one he'd spent years ignoring, the one that had gotten him into trouble long before he traded a uniform for a maintenance suit. And he exhaled slowly, checking the readout on his wrist, oxygen stable, temperature dropping fast, suit integrity at 93%. Nothing catastrophic yet, which meant he still had a choice. He could turn around, mark the coordinates, report it, let someone else handle whatever this was, because it wasn't his job anymore. None of it was. But then she tried to stand and failed, her hand pressing into the dust, fingers trembling as if the ground itself rejected her. And something in that movement felt too real to ignore, too human in the worst possible way. So he stepped forward despite the warning voice in his head, each boot sinking a few inches into the soft terrain, the wind pushing harder as if testing him. And when he reached her, close enough to see the fine lines etched along her skin, patterns that shimmered faintly beneath the surface like circuitry or veins of light, she flinched, not away, but toward him. Like instinct had chosen before thought could interfere. "Don't," she whispered, her voice breaking in a way that didn't match the strength her species was rumored to carry. And Ethan paused, crouching down just outside her reach, studying her, searching for the telltale signs of deception, a hidden weapon, a signal emitter, anything that would justify walking away. But there was only the sound of her breathing and the way her shoulders shook against the cold. And he shook his head once more, to himself then to her. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I've heard that one before." And then he closed the distance, sliding one arm behind her back, the other beneath her knees, lifting her carefully, expecting resistance, expecting the sudden shift that would prove this was a mistake. But she didn't fight. She didn't pull away. She just tensed as if bracing for something worse. And her skin was warm, warmer than it should have been in this environment, heat bleeding through the reinforced layers of his suit, a sensation that made his system flicker with a soft alert he ignored, because he was already committed now, already moving, adjusting her weight against his chest as he turned toward the distant outline of his outpost, 1.5 miles across uneven ground, not ideal, but manageable if the storm didn't worsen. And for a few seconds neither of them spoke. Just the rhythm of his steps and the howl of the wind filling the silence, until her voice came again, softer this time, almost curious beneath the strain. "Why would you carry me?" she asked, and Ethan glanced down at her, catching the way her eyes tracked his face, not fearful, not exactly, but searching for something he couldn't name, and he let out a breath that fogged briefly inside his visor. "Because you're here," he answered, simple, unpolished, the kind of truth that didn't need dressing up. And something shifted in her expression, subtle, like a crack forming in something carefully held together. But before he could read it fully, the sky above them pulsed, a faint vibration rolling through the air, low and distant, enough to make the hairs on the back of his neck stand up despite the suit. And Ethan slowed, his gaze lifting toward the clouds that suddenly didn't look so empty anymore. And for the first time since he'd picked her up, he wondered if he hadn't just stepped into something far bigger than a stranded traveler in the dust. The vibration did not fade. It grew, low and steady, like something massive shifting just beyond sight. And Ethan adjusted his grip on her instinctively, pulling her closer as the wind changed direction, sharper now, cutting across the plateau in unpredictable bursts, his boots slipping half an inch with each step as the ground beneath the dust hardened into uneven plates, and he glanced down at her again, expecting fear, panic, anything that matched the way the sky was beginning to hum. But she was watching him instead, not the storm, not the horizon, just him, her breathing still uneven but her eyes clearer now, focused in a way that made him uneasy. "You hear that?" he said, more to fill the silence than anything else, and she did not answer right away, her gaze drifting upward for a fraction of a second before returning to his face. "Yes," she said softly, and there was something in her tone that did not match someone caught off guard, something measured, almost familiar, and Ethan felt that warning tighten in his chest again, the one he had ignored once already. But he kept moving, because stopping out here was not an option, not with the temperature dropping and visibility shrinking by the minute. "Outpost is about a mile," he said, half to reassure himself, half to ground the moment in something practical. "We get inside, seal the doors, figure out what comes next." And she shifted slightly in his arms, not resisting, just adjusting as if testing the balance of his hold, her hand brushing against the front of his suit, lingering there for a second longer than necessary, and his system flickered again, a soft warning about heat transfer that he dismissed with a blink. "You should not have picked me up," she murmured, and this time there was no weakness in her voice, only a quiet certainty that made him slow by instinct. "Yeah," he replied, eyes scanning the horizon where the haze had started to ripple in unnatural patterns. "I am starting to get that feeling." And for a moment neither of them spoke, the distance to the outpost stretching longer than it should have, the structure still barely visible through the shifting dust, a dark silhouette against a sky that no longer felt empty. And then the sound above them sharpened, resolving into something more defined, a layered resonance that rolled across the clouds like distant thunder, but far too controlled to be natural. And Ethan stopped without meaning to, his gaze lifting fully now, tracking the subtle distortions forming overhead, shapes that were not quite visible but definitely there, massive outlines pressing against the atmosphere as if waiting just beyond it, and his grip tightened slightly, not out of fear, but out of instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive in places far worse than this. "You expecting company?" he asked, the question coming out flatter than he intended, and she exhaled slowly, her body relaxing in a way that did not match the situation at all, as if the danger he felt was not danger to her. And when she looked at him again, there was no trace of the trembling woman he had found minutes ago, only something older, steadier. "They are not here for you," she said, and Ethan let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "That is not exactly comforting," he replied, but he did not set her down, did not step back, even as the sky dimmed another shade, and the hum deepened into a presence he could feel through the soles of his boots, and she studied him for another long second, as if weighing something he could not see, before her fingers curled lightly against his suit, not gripping, just resting there, and her voice softened again, though the strength beneath it did not fade. "You can still leave," she said. "Put me down, walk away, and none of this will touch you." And Ethan looked at her, really looked this time, at the faint glow beneath her skin, at the steadiness in her eyes, at the contradiction of someone who had asked not to be touched now offering him a way out. And he shook his head once, slow and certain. "If this is going to get complicated," he said, adjusting his stance as the wind pushed harder against him. "It already is." And for the first time since he had found her, something like surprise flickered across her face, brief but unmistakable, and above them, the first line of light cut through the clouds, silent, precise, drawing a boundary across the sky that had not been there before, and Ethan felt the moment settle into something irreversible, even if he did not yet understand why. The line of light did not fade. It expanded, stretching across the sky with impossible precision until the clouds themselves seemed to part around it. And Ethan felt the pressure change, subtle but undeniable, like the air had decided to hold its breath, and he shifted his stance again, boots grinding against the hardened dust as he recalculated distance. 1.4 miles to the outpost, maybe less if the terrain leveled out ahead, but his eyes kept pulling upward, tracking the shapes that were no longer hiding, vast silhouettes now visible behind the thinning haze, their edges too clean, too deliberate to be anything natural, and his suit registered a spike in electromagnetic activity, numbers scrolling across his display faster than he could process. "That is not weather," he said quietly, more statement than question, and in his arms, she remained still, almost unnaturally so. Her earlier tremor completely gone, replaced by a calm that did not belong in this moment. "No," she replied, her voice steady, almost gentle, and that word settled heavier than anything else around them, because it confirmed what he already knew without explaining any of it. And Ethan exhaled slowly, forcing his focus back to the ground ahead, to the path, to the next step, because whatever was happening above them did not change the fact that he still had to move, still had to get somewhere with walls and systems and something resembling control, and he started forward again, each step, deliberate now, measured against the shifting terrain and the growing weight of the situation. "You said I could leave," he said after a few seconds, the words coming out slower than before. "But you also said they are not here for me." And he glanced down at her, searching for the gap between those two truths. "So which one is it?" And she did not answer immediately, her gaze drifting past him this time, toward the distant outline of his outpost, as if she could see more than he could, more than the structure itself. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried something new, not fear, not weakness, but a quiet honesty that cut through the tension. "Both," she said. And Ethan let out a short breath that almost turned into a laugh again, but stopped halfway, because nothing about this felt even remotely amusing anymore. "That is not how that works," he replied, and she tilted her head slightly, studying him in a way that felt far too focused for someone who had been barely able to stand minutes ago. "It is where I come from," she said, and for a moment, the wind seemed to drop just enough for the words to land clearly, and Ethan shook his head once, pushing forward through the last stretch of uneven ground as the outpost grew larger, its dark panels reflecting the strange light from above in fractured patterns. "Then where you come from sounds complicated," he muttered, and her lips curved just slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough to change the shape of her face. "You have no idea," she said, and that small shift in her expression did something unexpected. It made her seem less like a mystery and more like a person again, even as everything else about this situation screamed the opposite. And then the ground beneath them vibrated again, stronger. This time, a low pulse that traveled up through his boots and into his legs, and Ethan stopped once more, not by choice, but because his body reacted before his mind could catch up, and he looked up just as the first structure broke through the cloud layer, silent, massive, its surface reflecting the dim light in smooth, uninterrupted curves that suggested design far beyond anything he had worked on or even seen in passing, and his breath caught, just for a second, because scale like that did not belong this close to the ground, not without consequences, not without explanation, and yet there it was, descending slowly, deliberately, as if it had all the time in the world, and he felt the weight of it settle into his chest, heavy and unavoidable, and in his arms, she shifted again, but this time it was not to adjust or test, it was to turn slightly toward the sky, her eyes lifting to meet the descending shape with something that looked almost like recognition, and when she spoke, it was barely above a whisper, but it carried more certainty than anything she had said so far. "They are early," she murmured, and Ethan blinked, his grip tightening just enough to register. "Early for what?" he asked, the question leaving him before he could stop it, and she looked back at him, really looked this time, as if measuring not his strength or his choices, but something deeper, something quieter, and for the briefest moment, the calm in her expression wavered, replaced by something almost uncertain. "For finding me," she said, and the words hung between them as the shadow of the descending structure stretched across the ground, reaching for them both, and Ethan realized, with a clarity he could not ignore anymore, that whatever this was, whatever she was, he had already stepped too far in to walk away. The shadow reached them before the sound did, a smooth, expanding darkness that slid across the plateau like a second horizon, and Ethan felt the temperature drop another few degrees as his suit compensated with a quiet hum. The system's working harder now, pulling power he could not afford to waste, and he shifted his grip on her again, not because she was heavy, but because something about the way she had said it stayed with him. Early, not unexpected, not feared, just Early, and that word did not belong to someone lost or helpless. It belonged to someone who knew exactly what was coming. And that realization settled in his chest with a weight that matched the sky above. You knew they would come, he said, not accusing, just stating what was becoming impossible to ignore, and she did not deny it, her gaze still fixed upward as the massive structure continued its descent, silent, controlled, its surface reflecting the fractured light like liquid metal. I knew they would look, she replied, her voice calm, measured, and Ethan let out a slow breath through his nose, adjusting his stance as another low vibration rolled through the ground, stronger this time, enough to shift loose dust in small ripples around his boots. That is not the same thing, he said, and she finally looked back at him, her eyes clearer than they had been since the moment he found her. It is where I come from, she answered, and there was no arrogance in it, no superiority, just a quiet certainty that made arguing feel pointless, and Ethan shook his head slightly, turning his attention back to the outpost, now less than half a mile away, the structure standing firm against the shifting wind, its reinforced panels catching the strange light from above, and he started forward again, faster now, because whatever conversation they were having could wait until there was a door between them and the sky. We are getting inside, he said, more firmly this time, and then you can explain everything you are not saying. And for a moment she did not respond, her fingers still resting lightly against his suit, the faint warmth from her skin seeping through the layers like a second heartbeat. And then she spoke, softer than before. You are not afraid, she said, and Ethan almost smiled at that, not because it was true, but because it missed the point entirely. I am, he replied, eyes scanning the terrain ahead for any sudden shifts or hazards. I just do not let it decide what I do next. And something in that answer seemed to settle into her, not visibly, not in any way his instruments could measure, but he felt it in the way her hands stilled against him, in the way her breathing evened out just a fraction more, and above them, the descending structure slowed, hovering now, its presence dominating the sky, without a single audible engine or visible propulsion, and then smaller shapes began to separate from it, not falling, not rushing, just drifting downward in controlled lines, like fragments of the larger whole, and Ethan's jaw tightened slightly as he watched them, because that was the part that made it real, not the scale, not the light, but the intent behind it, the precision, the inevitability. Those yours too? He asked, the question quiet but direct. And she followed his gaze this time, her expression unreadable for a second before she answered, yes. And there it was, simple, undeniable, and Ethan nodded once, as if that confirmed something he had already decided, and he picked up his pace, boots striking harder against the ground as the outpost doors came into full view, the outer sensor array flickering as it registered the anomalies above, systems struggling to interpret something far beyond their design. Then we are definitely going inside, he said, and she let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though there was no humor in it, only a strange kind of relief. You still think walls will matter, she murmured, and Ethan did not look down this time, did not break stride. They matter to me, he said, and that was enough, because whatever she was, whatever she represented, he was still human, still grounded in things he could touch, doors he could close, systems he could control, even if only for a few minutes longer. And as they reached the perimeter, the ground pulsed again, deeper, resonating through the metal framework of the outpost itself, and the first of the descending shapes slowed directly above them, casting a focused beam of pale light that cut through the dust and settled just ahead of his path, not blocking him, not forcing him to stop, just waiting. And Ethan hesitated for the first time since he had picked her up, not out of fear, but because the choice in front of him had finally become visible, and in his arms, she turned her head slightly toward that light, her voice low, steady, carrying a weight that matched the moment. If you step into that, she said, everything changes, and Ethan looked at the beam, then at the outpost door 10 yards to his right, and then back at her, and in that pause, brief but absolute, he understood that leaving had never really been an option at all. The beam did not move, did not flicker, it simply existed, a column of pale light cutting through the storm as if the wind itself had been told to go around it, And Ethan stood there for half a second longer than he should have, his mind running through options that no longer felt like real choices. 10 yards to the outpost door, reinforced alloy, manual override still functional if the grid had not failed, and directly ahead, something that had crossed the distance between stars and decided to stop exactly where he stood, waiting without force, without demand, just presence. And that was what unsettled him most. Not the size, not the silence, but the patience behind it. You said everything changes, he said quietly, his eyes still fixed on the light. Define everything. And in his arms, she shifted slightly, not pulling away, not urging him forward, just existing in that space with him as if the decision truly belonged to him. And when she answered, her voice carried none of the uncertainty from before. You stopped being invisible, she said, and that landed harder than anything else she had told him so far, because invisibility had been his choice, his refuge after everything he had walked away from. The reason he took this contract on a forgotten rock where nothing important was supposed to happen, and he let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of that word settle into his chest. I was fine with that, he replied, and she tilted her head slightly, studying him again, not as a stranger this time, but as something more defined. You were not, she said simply, and Ethan almost argued, almost pushed back, but the words did not come, because somewhere under the layers of routine and distance, he knew she was not entirely wrong, and the ground pulsed again. Stronger now, the vibration aligning with the light in front of them, as if the two were connected, part of the same system, and above, the smaller shapes continued their slow descent, forming a pattern that was no longer random, a perimeter, controlled and deliberate, and Ethan exhaled once more, then shifted his weight, turning slightly toward the outpost door, taking one step in that direction, just one, enough to test the feeling, enough to prove to himself that the option was still there. And nothing stopped him. The beam did not react, the sky did not change, and for a second, that almost made the decision easier. Almost, because it meant walking away was still possible, still simple, still safe. And then he looked down at her again, at the way her eyes followed his movement, not with fear, not with expectation, but with something quieter, something that did not ask him to stay and did not ask him to leave, and that absence of pressure did something unexpected. It made the choice feel heavier, not lighter, and he let out a small breath that fogged his visor again. You could have told me, he said, not accusing, just stating what might have changed things earlier, and she held his gaze, unflinching. You would not have believed me, she replied, and he nodded once, because that was probably true, and then he turned back toward the beam, taking a single step forward this time, not rushed, not forced, just decided. And the moment his boot crossed into the edge of that pale light, everything shifted, not violently, not dramatically, but enough that he felt it immediately. The wind dropped to almost nothing, the constant pressure against his suit easing as if the storm had been placed on pause, the temperature stabilizing within a narrow range his system no longer had to fight, and the hum around him changed, becoming clearer, more defined, like a frequency finally coming into focus, and he stilled, not out of fear, but because the difference was undeniable, and in his arms, she exhaled slowly, a breath that sounded less like tension and more like release, and when he looked down at her, the faint glow beneath her skin had intensified, not bright, not overwhelming, just enough to make the patterns beneath the surface more visible, more structured, and her eyes held his in a way that felt entirely different from before, not searching, not testing, but acknowledging. Now they can see you, she said softly, and Ethan glanced up, watching as one of the descending shapes adjusted its position, aligning directly above them, responding not to her, but to him. And that realization settled in quietly, but completely, because it meant this was no longer about finding her alone. It was about him being part of what they had found, and for the first time since this began, he understood that carrying her had not just been an act of kindness, it had been a choice that changed where he stood in a universe he had tried very hard to ignore. The light did not feel like light anymore. It felt like attention, focused and precise, wrapping around Ethan in a way his suit could not measure, but his instincts refused to ignore, and he stood still for a moment longer, adjusting to the sudden calm that replaced the storm. the silence almost louder than the wind had been, and his display flickered again, recalibrating as external variables dropped to near zero. "That is not natural," he said under his breath, and in his arms, she shifted. Just enough to turn toward him fully, her eyes steady, no longer searching, no longer guarded. "It is controlled," she corrected gently, and Ethan let out a quiet breath, because that difference mattered more than he wanted it to. And above them, the shape aligned overhead began to change, its surface opening in smooth, seamless layers that did not separate so much as reconfigure, revealing a deeper glow within, softer than the beam but far more deliberate, and smaller lights moved along its edges, not erratic, not mechanical in any way he recognized, just aware, tracking, responding, and Ethan felt that awareness settle on him again, heavier this time, as if the system had adjusted its focus, refining what it saw, and he tightened his grip slightly without meaning to, grounding himself in something real, something he could still understand. "You said they can see me now," he said, his voice quieter than before. "What does that actually mean?" And she watched him for a long second, as if deciding how much truth he could handle in one moment. "It means you are no longer background," she said, and he frowned slightly, eyes flicking up to the hovering structure again. "I was never background," he replied, but even as he said it, he knew how that sounded, how it had been his entire goal for years, to be exactly that, to work, to fix, to exist without drawing attention, and she shook her head slowly, a small movement, but deliberate. "To them, you were," she said. "Now you are not." And the simplicity of it made it harder to argue, because it did not sound like judgment, it sounded like fact, and Ethan exhaled again, shifting his weight as the ground beneath him gave one more subtle pulse, not unsettling this time, just synchronized, as if the entire area had been brought into alignment with whatever hovered above. And then the beam itself changed, not in brightness, but in density, the air within it shimmering slightly as if layers were being added, structured, and for a brief second, Ethan saw something move within it, not descending, not rising, just forming, a shape that hinted at structure before dissolving again, and his eyes narrowed slightly, trying to make sense of it. "Are they coming down here?" he asked, and her expression softened just a fraction, something almost like understanding passing through her gaze. "They already are," she said, and he followed her line of sight, not upward this time, but forward, into the beam itself, and for the first time, he realized it was not empty, not truly. There were patterns there, shifting, aligning, like pieces of something, assembling in real time, and his breath slowed, not out of fear, but out of focus, the kind that came when a problem stopped being theoretical and became immediate. And then she moved, just slightly, her hand lifting from his suit to rest against his chest more deliberately, her touch steady, grounding, and when she spoke again, her voice was lower, closer, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with the storm or the sky. "You can still put me down," she said. "Step back, and they will recalibrate." And Ethan looked at her, really looked this time, at the way she held herself now, not as someone being carried, but as someone choosing to be, and he understood what she was offering, not escape from the situation, but distance from her place in it, a way to separate himself from whatever she represented before it locked him in completely. And he shook his head once, slow, certain. "You said everything changes," he replied, his voice steady now. "I am starting to think that already happened." And for a moment, she just watched him, something unspoken passing between them, something that did not need explanation, and then the beam intensified again, the patterns within it stabilizing, resolving into something more defined, and Ethan felt the air shift once more, not pressure this time, but presence, as if whatever had been observing had decided it was time to be seen, and he straightened slightly, not in defiance, not in submission, just in acknowledgement, because whether he understood it or not, he was already part of this moment, and walking away was no longer the same as it had been 10 yards back, before the light, before the choice, before her. The patterns in the beam stopped shifting, and for the first time since he stepped into it, Ethan could see something that held its shape, not fully solid, not entirely light, but something in between, a presence that formed from the air itself, tall, precise, and impossibly still, and his breath slowed without him noticing, not out of fear, but because the moment demanded it. Because whatever stood in front of him did not feel like something that needed to move to prove its power, and he adjusted his stance slightly, grounding his weight evenly, his grip on her steady but no longer protective in the same way, because she was not the one at risk anymore, not here, not now. And she did not look at the figure as if it were unknown. She did not flinch or tense. She simply watched it the way one acknowledges something expected, something familiar, and that told him more than anything else. This is them, he said quietly, and she nodded once, a small, deliberate movement. One of them, she corrected, and Ethan let out a slow breath, eyes tracing the edges of the form as it became clearer, lines of light defining structure without revealing detail, like a silhouette built from intention rather than matter. And then it spoke, not with sound in the air, but with something that bypassed that entirely, a presence of meaning that settled directly into his awareness, steady and controlled, not invasive, just there. And Ethan blinked once, instinctively trying to place it, to translate it into something familiar. And the closest comparison his mind found was a voice without vibration, clear without volume. Designation confirmed. The presence conveyed, and Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, because that word did not sit right with him, not applied to a person, not applied to him. And before he could respond, she spoke, her voice audible this time, calm, measured. He is not a designation, she said, and there was no defiance in it, no challenge, just correction, and the figure shifted, not physically, but in focus, its attention narrowing, refining, and Ethan felt that shift like a change in gravity, subtle but undeniable. And then the presence came again, clearer this time, directed specifically at him. You altered the outcome. It conveyed, and Ethan frowned slightly, because that was not an accusation, not praise, just statement. And he exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully even though he was not entirely sure how they were being received. I picked someone up, he said, keeping his voice level, grounded. That is not exactly altering the universe. And for a brief second, nothing changed, no reaction, no response, just the steady presence of that awareness holding him in place. And then the meaning returned, more defined. It is, from our perspective, and that landed differently, not because of what it meant, but because of how simply it was delivered. And Ethan glanced down at her, just for a moment, catching the way she watched the exchange, not surprised, not impressed, just attentive. And then he looked back at the figure. So what now? He asked, and there was no edge in his voice, no challenge, just a question that needed an answer, and the presence did not respond immediately, as if the concept itself required consideration. And during that pause, the air around them shifted again, not in pressure, not in temperature, but in clarity, the beams stabilizing further, the patterns locking into place, and Ethan felt it then, not through his suit, not through any instrument, but directly, a sense of alignment, like something had decided where he fit within it. And then the answer came, steady, undeniable. Now, you are observed. It conveyed, and Ethan let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, because that was not what he expected, not a command, not a demand, just attention, and he shook his head slightly. That does not sound like a plan, he said, and for the first time since it appeared, the presence shifted again, not in form, but in tone, if that was even the right word. It is the beginning of one, it replied, and beside him, she moved, not to step away, not to take control, but simply to place her hand more firmly against his chest, her touch grounding, steady, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than before, but carried more weight than anything she had said yet. They are deciding if you matter, she said. And Ethan glanced at her, then back at the figure, and something in him settled, not acceptance, not resistance, just clarity, because for the first time since this began, he understood the scale of what he had stepped into. And he also understood that the choice he made next would not be about survival or escape. It would be about something far simpler and far more dangerous, whether he stayed himself while all of this tried to redefine him. The word observed did not leave him the way the others had. It stayed, settled somewhere deeper than sound or thought, and Ethan stood there in the stillness of the beam, feeling the weight of something that did not need to press harder to be understood. And for a moment, he said nothing, not because he had nothing to say, but because the usual responses did not fit here, not with something that measured meaning instead of words, and beside him. Her hand remained steady against his chest, not restraining, not guiding, just present, like an anchor in a place where gravity had become uncertain, and he exhaled slowly, eyes lifting to the figure again. "You are deciding if I matter," he said, repeating her words without looking away, and the presence did not deny it, did not soften it. It simply remained, which was answer enough, and Ethan nodded once, a small movement, but deliberate. "Then you are asking the wrong question," he added, and that, finally, caused a shift, not visible, but perceptible, like a recalibration of focus, and the meaning returned, sharper this time, directed fully at him. "Clarify." It conveyed, and Ethan adjusted his stance, not defensive, not aggressive, just grounded, the way he had learned to stand when everything else moved around him. "You are measuring impact," he said, choosing each word carefully. "Outcomes, variables, changes," and he glanced down at her for a fraction of a second, then back at the figure. "But that is not why I did it." And there was a pause, longer this time, not empty, but processing, and the air within the beam seemed to tighten slightly, as if the system itself had narrowed its parameters, and the presence responded. "Intent is irrelevant to outcome." And Ethan almost smiled at that, not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete. "Not where I come from," he replied, and for the first time, the silence that followed felt different, less certain, less absolute, and he continued before it could close again. "I did not carry her because it would change anything," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. "I did it because she needed it, and that was it. No elaboration, no justification, just the simplest truth he had, and the beam held that statement the way it had held everything else, weighing it, aligning it against whatever scale these beings used, and beside him, she did not speak, did not interrupt, but he felt the subtle shift in her presence, the way her hand pressed just slightly more firmly against him, not to influence the moment, but to acknowledge it, and above them, the massive structure adjusted again, not descending further, not retreating, just repositioning in a way that suggested a change in perspective rather than location, and the smaller shapes aligned more precisely, forming a pattern that no longer felt like containment, but like focus, and when the presence returned, it carried something new, not uncertainty, not confusion, but consideration. "Your species prioritizes individual need over systemic efficiency," it conveyed, and Ethan let out a quiet breath, because that was one way to describe it. "Sometimes," he said, "not always." And that honesty mattered, even here, especially here, and the presence held that as well, the nuance, the lack of perfection, and then it shifted again, its attention moving not away from him, but through him, as if mapping something deeper than his words, and for a brief second, Ethan felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical vulnerability, but he did not step back, did not close off, he just stood there, letting whatever they saw be what it was, because hiding had never been about denial, it had been about distance, and that was already gone, and then the meaning came again, quieter than before, but heavier. "You acted without expectation of return," it conveyed, and Ethan nodded once, because that was the point. "Yes," he said, and the presence paused, not in uncertainty, but in something closer to recalibration, and when it spoke again, the tone had shifted, subtle but undeniable. That variable was not accounted for, and Ethan blinked once, because that was the closest thing to surprise he had heard from it, and beside him, she exhaled softly, a sound that almost carried relief, and then she finally spoke, her voice calm, but with a depth that had not been there before. "That is why I chose him," she said, and Ethan turned his head slightly toward her, just enough to catch the way she looked at him now, not as someone who had found her, not as someone who had carried her, but as someone she had decided on, and that realization settled into the space between them, quiet but undeniable, and above them, the light shifted once more, not brighter, not stronger, just open, as if whatever decision had been forming was finally reaching its edge, and Ethan understood then that this was the moment that would define everything that came after, not because of what they would do, but because of what he had already chosen to be. The light did not intensify. It settled, like a decision that no longer needed to prove itself, and Ethan stood there with the weight of it resting around him, not pressing down, not lifting him up, just acknowledging. And for the first time since the beam formed, the presence in front of him changed in a way he could understand, not in shape, not in structure, but in intention, the attention that had been measuring now holding, not as a variable, not as an outcome, but as something defined. And the meaning came again, slower this time, deliberate, assessment updated. It conveyed, and Ethan let out a quiet breath, not because it was over, but because something had shifted, something that would not shift back, and beside him, her hand remained steady against his chest, but now there was warmth in it that had nothing to do with her physiology, something quieter, more human than anything he had seen from her before, and she looked at him differently, not evaluating, not selecting, but recognizing. And that was when he understood what had changed, not the sky, not the ships, not even the presence watching them, but the space between them, the distance that had been there from the moment he picked her up, now gone, replaced by something that did not need explanation, and he exhaled slowly, eyes lifting once more to the figure. "So what does that mean?" he asked, not challenging, not demanding, just needing clarity, and the presence responded without delay this time. "You are no longer incidental," it conveyed, and that word settled differently than observed had, because incidental meant temporary, replaceable, and this was not that, and Ethan nodded once, accepting the weight of it without trying to reshape it into something easier. And then the meaning continued, unfolding in a way that felt less like a statement and more like a conclusion. "Your actions demonstrate non-transactional value." And he almost smiled again, because that was a complicated way to say something simple. "I helped someone," he said quietly, and for the first time, the presence did not correct him, did not refine the statement into something more precise. It simply accepted it, and that acceptance carried more weight than any analysis before it. And above them, the massive structure shifted again, not descending further, but opening, the layered surface parting just enough to reveal depth beyond it. Not an interior, not a space he could define, but something that extended further than the eye could follow. And the beam around him softened at the edges, the rigid boundary dissolving into something more fluid, and the smaller shapes that had formed the perimeter adjusted in response, not tightening, not closing in, but widening, as if making room rather than enforcing limits. And Ethan felt that change ripple through the ground beneath him, through the air around him, through the quiet space where the storm had once been, and beside him, she moved, not away, not stepping out of his arms, but turning slightly toward him, her hand sliding from his chest to rest against his shoulder, her gaze steady, unwavering, and when she spoke, her voice carried none of the distance it had before, only clarity. "You were not supposed to matter," she said softly, and Ethan let out a small breath, because that was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in a long time. "I get that a lot," he replied, and for a brief second, something like amusement touched her expression, subtle, but real, and then the presence spoke again, not to him alone this time, but to both of them. The meaning broader, more encompassing, integration permitted, it conveyed, and Ethan's brow furrowed slightly, not in resistance, but in confusion. "Integration into what?" he asked, and there was a pause, not empty, but final, as if the answer did not need elaboration. "Into relevance," it replied, and that word echoed in a way the others had not through the air, not through his thoughts, but through something quieter, something that settled into place without asking for permission, and Ethan stood there, holding her, feeling the weight of everything that had just been decided, everything that had just changed, and he did not move, did not step forward into whatever had opened above them, did not step back toward the outpost that suddenly felt very far away. He just stood there, because for once, stillness felt like the right choice, and in that stillness, she leaned in, not because she needed support, not because she was weak, but because she chose to, her forehead resting lightly against his shoulder, her breath steady, grounded, and Ethan did not question it, did not pull away, he simply remained, and above them, the sky held, the ships waited, the presence observed. But for that one moment, none of it mattered as much as the quiet, undeniable truth that settled between them, that in a universe measuring power and outcome and control, something as simple as being human had been enough to be seen, enough to be chosen, enough to change everything.